Hi everyone, and welcome to the Fedwire Funds Service November 2026 ISO 2022 release webinar. Most, if not all of you know that last year on July 14th, we successfully implemented ISO 2022 for the Fedwire Funds Service, thereby decommissioning our proprietary format FAME that had been in place for decades. In October, we announced that the Fedwire Funds Service's intention to implement a series of changes to that ISO 2022 implementation we went live with last July 14th. We are making these changes to ensure we protect the global interoperability and align with changes that both SWIFT, for payments sent in the cross-border space, and most of our peer operators, including CHIPS for domestic high-value US dollar payments, have already committed to in the same time frame. In this webinar, we will provide you with an overview of the changes for November 2026. Now let's have a look at the agenda for today. My name is Frank VanDriessche and I'm a member of the Federal Reserve Financial Services ISO 2022 practice team. I will start with a quick overview of the resources we are making available to help you prepare for this upcoming release. Then we will dive into what's in scope for the November 2026 release that, by the way, is scheduled to go live on November 15th for business or cycle day, November 16, 2026. We will talk about character sets, the implementation of the globally agreed hybrid postal address format, and then we will spend most of our time explaining how, as of November 2026, you will be able to leverage enhancements to our ISO 2022 investigation messages to optimize your payment investigation processes. Let's start with some information on the documentation and tools first. In the next set of slides, I will point out where you can find complete information on what I will cover in today's webinar, including tools we have already made available to our community to start testing against the changes scheduled for November 2026. First of all ISO 2022 message specifications, collateral, and testing tools are available on the Federal Reserve Financial Services landing pages on SWIFT's MyStandards platform. Access to MyStandards is available to everyone with a MyStandards account that is free and does not require a SWIFT connection or SWIFT membership at all. When you go to the pages for the Federal Reserve Financial Services, you have to access the Fedwire Funds Service. You will find also the FedNow pages there, so just make sure that you select the appropriate community. On this slide, you see here that the Fedwire Funds Service is a subgroup of the Federal Reserve Financial Services landing pages, so make sure you access the appropriate community when you're looking for Fedwire Funds Service specifications. I'm going to start with the middle of this slide. You see a couple of tabs: usage guidelines, open communities, and portals. And I would like to start with the communities in the middle. Now, the membership or access to the Fedwire Funds Service specifications on MyStandards is open to everyone, as I mentioned. But the first time you access our landing page, you have to request access by clicking this button. This button originally says request access. When you click it, you automatically are granted access to all our documentation and specifications. You may just need to refresh your browser to see this grayed out membership button appear. This is the most often asked question. I do not have access. It's automatically granted when you click that button. Just refresh your browser and you will see what you're seeing right now. Now, I want to move to the right side of this, the left side of this slide first. Now, what we see here is that there's a series of usage guidelines, and we're going to focus on the top one, which is the Fedwire Funds Service 2026 release, which is planned, as mentioned, and I will be repeating that date often. This will go in for business day, November 16, 2026. You also find there the Fedwire Funds Service 2025 release, which is the live release, which is the release we went live with on July 14th, 2025. So just make sure that if you're interested in our specifications for the current release, you need to access the live one. If you want to access the details of what changes are coming in 2026, make sure you click on the 2026 planned release button. Now let's have a look at the portals before we actually dive into that detail. So to the right side of this slide, you will find what we call readiness portals, or portals where you can test your specifications. Now you see here, there's a lot of individual portals. For example, the first one here talks about the customer credit transfers. You see the financial institution credit transfers, the drawdowns, the investigations, and there's more portals available. This is where you can test the current release, so the 2025 14th live release. What we have created to test against the 2026 November release specifications is one single portal, and the name is clear. It says the 2026 November Fedwire Funds Service release. So this is where you will be able to test your test messages against what we will implement in November 2026. A quick word about our DIT environments, our depository institution testing environments. Today's live specifications can be tested as we speak in our DIT environment. The planned release for November 2026 will be enabled for testing in our DIT2 environment in the May 2026 timeframe. So just to clarify, for now, if you want to test for the upcoming release, you need to do your testing in the online web portal on My Standards here. The DIT2 environment for testing will only become available as of May 2026. Now, let's click first on the usage guidelines. What is planned for 2026? When we click on this, we are brought to the collection, as we call it, of implementation or usage guidelines for the November 2026 release. Now, there's 27 guidelines in total that we went live with in 2025 and that we will have in 2026. But the status indicator that you see here indicates whether for 2026 anything to that guideline is changing or not. When you see modified, it means that the customer credit transfer implementation, so the PAX 8 that many of you know very well, has been modified as part of our release preparation for November 2026. But many of the other guidelines you see have not changed compared to the implementation of July 2025. Now, the tool offers you the opportunity or the possibility to select and only see what has modified. So when you click on modified, it will take you to the screen and show you what messages are impacted by the November 2026 release. Now, the good news is that this screen shows all messages that are impacted. Only 9 out of the 27 implementation guidelines that we went live with last July will change in November 2026. Some more than others, and that is what we will cover in the webinar, what is in scope of the release 2026. More collateral for this release can be found by clicking on the Show Details here. When you click on Show Details, it will show you that 2 documents are available to learn more about the 2026 release. You can access and download these documents relevant for the upcoming release, and there's 2 documents as you can see. Let me just move to the next slide. One is our Fedwire Funds Service ISO 2022 Implementation Guide, which is a business-focused document of how to use ISO 2022 for the individual message flows. And on the right side, you see our Readiness Portal Guide, setting out, describing test scenarios with descriptions and sample messages that are available on My Standards. I will come back to this shortly, but we actually have separate webinars where these documents and their contents are explained in more detail. Now, going back to the My Standards Readiness portal, when we click on the right side, because we're interested in testing against the November 2026 specifications, then you access this portal by clicking on it. And here, I know it's full, there's a lot there. You can access samples, you can find documentation for all messages in scope of the November 2026 release, and you can upload your test sample messages and see how well they score against the November 2026 specifications. Okay, with this, I'm going to wrap up the documentation and tools overview in this webinar. Let's now move on to the actual scope of the 2026 release. Now, for an overview of changes, first of all, let's take you back to the implementation guide, where at the beginning of that document, you will find a section that is called the document change history, and you will find an easy one-page summary of all the changes that we're making in the November 2026 release compared to July 14, 2025 release that we went live with. So just have a look. It's an overview of the things that are changing in November. And as you see here, this is the implementation guide version 2, released on the 13th of November 2025 for implementation on the 16th of November 2026. Now, we will cover these changes now in more detail during the webinar. First of all, I'm going to start with a word on the character set. Now, first and foremost, the set of permissible characters is not changing. We've just added what we call a pattern to our message schemas to allow for better and more formal testing in the readiness portal. And you see an example of such pattern on the bottom of the screen there. Again, this is just to help you as you upload your messages in the readiness portal on My Standards. That will now also include a test of permissible characters. But our character set is exactly the same as what we went live with in July, which, by the way, was exactly the same character set as the character set we allowed during our theme period, the proprietary theme format that we used for decades. 2 points of attention. When we went live in July 2025, some of you ran into issues with some special characters that slipped through. We will implement the check as part of that pattern that the control return, the line feed, and the tab characters will no longer be allowed. These were not allowed in the first place, but they weren't captured as part of our validation. So if you use these, they will cause for a rejection by the Fedwire Funds Service application. As we will also reject elements that only contain empty spaces. So some users were bypassing validation by just filling blank spaces in elements. That will also be picked up by the pattern. It is not allowed to send an element with content that only contains blank spaces. But the most important point is that the character set that we are used today in our live environment remains the same character set when we upgrade in November 2026. We will just address some of the issues that were discovered immediately after going live last July 2025. The hybrid postal address. I'm sure you have been hearing a lot about the introduction of the hybrid postal address structure. This way of structuring postal address information, including setting some minimum requirements of data that has to be provided in a structured way, has been globally agreed by the payments industry as a best practice. So also we, the Fedwire Funds Service, will upgrade our ISO 2022 implementation coming November 2026 to align with that globally agreed format and minimum requirements. Now, what is the hybrid postal address format? It is an implementation that allows the combination of strictly formatted information with some more flexible free-formatted address lines. Very similar to a hybrid car that allows you to drive using sometimes gas and sometimes electricity. Now, let me walk you through the actual changes. The left side of this slide we reflect today's implementation of postal address information. On top of this slide, you see a series of structured elements to provide precise information: department, sub-department, street name, building number, town name, which what we call city, postal code, country subdivisions, which are the US states, for example. All this can be documented in specific elements. All the way on the bottom, you see the possibility to provide up to 3 lines, address lines, of up to 35 characters maximum of free formatted address information. Now, in today's environment, you cannot combine the structured option with the free formatted option, and usage is governed by rules that are now shown on the bottom. First of all, postal address rule 1 that we went live with remains. You cannot use postal address if you don't have a name. So when you provide and identify your beneficiary, your ordering customer in ISO lingo, creditor and debtor, you cannot provide an address if you're not giving the name of your customer. So postal address is never allowed if there is no name present. The second and third rule kind of like limit the usage, where the first one says that free formatted address lines are mutually exclusive with structured information. So you have to choose. Either your address is unstructured or structured, but you cannot combine the information. And postal address rule 3 that we have today requires, if you use structured, that you provide at least the country and city, or in ISO lingo, town name. Now, what is changing in November? We're moving all identifiers for parties, entities, and financial institutions to the hybrid postal address format. Now, as you can see, the hybrid postal address, as it says, you can combine information that is structured with not structured or free formatted address information. First of all, whenever you provide address information, you always must provide, the minimum requirement is always to provide the town name or city and the country code. And then you can use a combination of any of these structured elements, including 2 address lines of up to 70 characters. So that is the hybrid format. The rules 2 and 3 no longer apply, because we allow mixing structured and free formatted information, because not all communities around the world necessarily have well-structured addresses. So you can combine an address line with any of these structured elements to provide further information not covered by the structured elements, but you always have to provide, at the minimum, country and town name reflected by this 1 in this column. Important remark, this applies to all persons, entities, and financial institutions postal address information in ISO 2022 messages sent across the Fedwire Funds Service when provided. What do I mean with that? The persons, entities used in messages across the Fedwire Funds Service, for those, postal address is optional when a name is used. You cannot use postal address without name, but you may use name without postal address information. Now, the postal address information may be required under applicable law, and we invite all our participants to the Fedwire Funds Service to always confirm requirements with their legal and compliance teams. But from a Fedwire Funds validation point of view, we do not require postal address with a name. Even when not required, though, we strongly recommend to provide address information always to the extent possible. Now, this is everything I have to say about a hybrid postal address. While this might seem a small change, and it is from a pure ISO 2022 formatting point of view, the impact is rather big on your databases, your upstream and downstream systems, so please make sure you do an in-depth impact assessment on how this reformatting of postal address information will impact you and your clients. because while it may be small from an ISO 2022 point of view, and you see actually it's a cleanup, we don't need kind of like complex rules, postal address 2 and 3 anymore. We now just have a clean format with one rule that you cannot use postal address without name. The impact on your systems and clients is way bigger to provide at the minimum, to meet the minimum requirements of providing country code and city for your persons, entities, and or financial institutions involved in your payment sent across the Fedwire Funds Service. Again, this is a globally agreed format that will be implemented by all our peers in similar timelines comes November 2026. Okay, investigation message updates. For all our investigators out there, let's now focus on the changes we will be making to the investigation messages, the CAMT 110, the investigation request, and the CAMT 111 investigation response messages to be implemented in November 2026. We're making these changes to allow you to further automate and streamline your investigation processes. There are quite a lot of changes as we align our initial limited scope implementation of July 14, 2025 with international best practice that has been defined in the meantime. Many of those changes are new features and many of those are implemented on an optional basis, so it will depend a little bit on the use cases of your investigations. First of all, before diving into the investigation request changes, we are not going to cover today the investigation request CAMT 110 and the investigation response CAMT 111 in full detail. For a complete overview of the messages, please refer to our implementation guides, the implementation guide and the readiness portal guide that we referenced earlier today, where you can find full-blown descriptions under Chapter 9, Investigations. Or even better, please visit our online Fedwire Funds Service ISO 2022 Implementation Center. You see the link there. Navigate to the educational opportunities here to access a series of on-demand webinars. And as you can see, there is a deep dive into the investigation messages available for your consumption. So that is a webinar that we recorded that will explain the investigation messages in their full beauty, I should say. The deep dive, in combination with what we will cover in the next half hour, will provide you with a complete overview in preparation of November 2026. Now, while I'm here, a quick pitch for our other webinars that you might benefit from. If you want, for example, more information on how to use my standards, the resources, the readiness portal, the testing tools, there is a specific webinar, My Standards, Resources, Tools, and Testing, that you can access on demand if you want to learn how to make the best use of the My Standards web portals. There's introductions, and for every single Fedwire Funds message flow, whether it's credit transfers, customer credit transfers, payment returns, financial institution transfers, drawdowns, we have an appropriate webinar for each of these individual specific message flows. Okay, let's start with the investigation request or the CAMT 110 message. Without going into too much detail, this message is sent to request information on a previously received message or to provide further information on a previously sent message between Fedwire Funds Service participants. You can request information on value and non-value messages previously exchanged between participants. You should not use this message, for example, to request the return of funds, as for that we have a specific ISO 2022 message, more specifically the CAMT 56 or the return request. As we will cover later, the investigation request will be answered with an investigation response or CAMT 111 message. Quick look at the message flow. Under step 1 in this diagram, we see that, for example, a customer credit transfer PAX 8 message was sent and processed across the Fedwire Funds Service. Step 2, highlighted in blue, is our focus here, and that is where the receiver of that funds transfer message asks the sender a question in order to process the transaction and apply the funds to the intended creditor. That message is what we will focus on now. Now, the message has a series of building blocks that we will cover in the next 7 slides. Now, I want to repeat again that our focus for this webinar is on the changes compared to our limited scope July 2025 implementation. These changes are across those 7 slides highlighted in red. I will briefly touch upon all elements and components, but the focus and a full exhaustive explanation will be on the changes. For all the other information that is not changing, we refer to both the guide and the investigations webinar. Now, the investigation request is a single mandatory component to identify the ongoing investigation. Now, what is changing? And you see quite some red in there because of that limited scope implementation in July 14th, which basically mimicked our free-formatted service message in the same format. We're now enhancing that by enabling other features that the ISO 2022 investigation messages offer. First of all, the message identification. This is where your IMAT goes, will not come as a surprise. Requester investigation, responder investigation identification. This is where you can provide your references. Now, there is a new reference highlighted in red here, which is called the EIR, which is a unique end-to-end investigation reference. Now, there is a rule, as you can see in red, that when you send a CAMT 110 investigation request message, as of November 2026, you will have to provide either a requester investigation reference or the EIR. Both may be present, but we will be looking from a validation point of view for at least one of these references. So that's new, and that's aligning with the international standard and internationally defined practice. Request action is a brand new component. It is used when following up on a previously sent investigation request, a CAMT 110 message. This is optional, and I will cover the meaning of this request action component on the next slide. Investigation type and investigation subtype are not changing compared to our July 2025 implementation. But then we see yet another new component, which is called underlying instrument. This is where you will specify the payment instrument to which the investigation request refers. I will cover that also in a separate slide. Underlying, which is where you identify the message that is under investigation, is slightly changing, identified with an amber coloring here. Then you have the requester and responder, which is the sender of the investigation request, your Fedwire sender and Fedwire receiver. And then we have 2 more elements that I will cover here. Both of them are optional. Request originator is where you may, on an optional basis, identify the person, entity, or financial institution that originated the investigation request. This is optional because if the Fedwire sender is initiating the investigation, you don't need to specify it, but it could be that one of your customers is initiating the investigation, and you could identify that this is an investigation initiated by the customer and not the Fedwire participant's sender. Service level is also new, and this is where on an optional basis you can specify the expected response times. Now, this is a request to respond within a certain number of days. A series of codes have been identified that you will find in our full-blown implementation guide or our message usage guidelines on My Standards. But for example, you can request a response within the business day, within 3 business days, within 5 business days. There's a series of codes that have been defined. You see one there on screen. R01D is where you would like to get a response within 1 business day. This is an optional element that you may or may not use. Now let's have a look at the request action component, which is a new component, single, optional, to follow up on a previously sent investigation request. Now that is an important point for this component. You will only use this component when you're following up on a CAMT 110 investigation request that you sent previously. Now, short component required is use of the action element, which is where you will specify what is requested in a coded form. And you see the codes there on the right side of the slide. You can ask for the investigation to be closed. You can ask for an investigation status, and you can ask or send that you object to the previously received response and provide a reason why you are objecting. Now, one of the codes that will definitely resonate with our audience today is, for example, where you ask for an investigation status. Because what we've heard a couple of months in since we went live is that not all investigation requests are always answered. So what you could do if you do not receive an answer to your question is resend your investigation request, and in the request action component, you will use the code RQST, where you say, I'm following up on a previously sent investigation request for which I have not received a response so far. Now, the action reason, it depends a little bit obviously on the use case. Are you closing the investigation? Are you following up? Are you objecting to the response? But you may use action reasons, and some of them definitely will resonate. You could send that you're closing your investigation, for example, for the first code, IRSI, because it was sent in error. You made a mistake, you send a question to the wrong bank, for example. You can say, please close this investigation, I sent it by mistake. You can send IRRR, which means in the meantime, the problem has been resolved. You can provide further information, for example, that you're disputing some of the compensation discussions. You can object to response that you consider incomplete, or as always, the escape code is if you do not find any of these above codes useful, you can always use the narrative to say why you're following up to your previously sent investigation request. Useful component to follow up, but remember, it's only to follow up on a previously sent investigation request. Let's move to the next component. Investigation type and investigation subtype. As I mentioned, these are not really changing, but we did notice that one of the investigation subtype codes that you see on screen in red, liquidity, has been removed from the externalized code lists. So that code is no longer to be used. I do want to draw your attention to the top corner note. There are some rules around the use of combining certain investigation types and subtype codes with other elements, mainly restrictions of certain combinations that would not make sense. For these strict technical details, we invite you to consult the message specifications on my standards. That would take us too much into the weeds for today's webinar. But some of the codes, investigation type codes, cannot be combined with some of the subtype codes because it just does not make sense. Okay, underlying instrument, short and sweet but required. This is a mandatory single element to specify in a coded form the payment instrument to which the investigation refers. Now, what codes are available, and more might be created in the future. You see there that if you're investigating an instant payment, you would use INST. Cross-border credit transfer investigations, high-value payment or wire investigations, ACH, retail mass payment investigations, or other. Now, obviously, as we're talking about the Fedwire Funds wire system, most of the time, if not always, your underlying instrument will either be the cross-border credit transfer that you're investigating that was settled across the Fedwire Funds Service, or the high-value payment or wire code that you will use to indicate that you're investigating Fedwire Funds wire. Underlying, not that much has changed in this component, where you identify the transaction under investigation by a series of reference elements of the original transaction that you're investigating. We have heard your feedback that sometimes you may not have these references as you want to trigger an investigation. Now, what we had in our implementation that went live in July 2025 was enable use of the initiation box, which you have to use when you're investigating a drawdown request or drawdown response, or the interbank box that you were using when you were investigating a value message, for example, a PAX 8, customer credit transfer, a PAX 9, financial institution credit transfer, or a payment return, PAX 4. Now, we heard you that not all your investigations are always related to a drawdown request or a value message. So we are enabling on an optional basis a third option, other, it's called, that you can use when sending an investigation not directly related to a payment or a drawdown request. So an optional enhancement for those use cases where you need to investigate something other than a value or non-value message sent across the Fedwire Funds Service. Almost there. Last but one block, investigation data. You see that most of the elements here, this is a mandatory repetitive component where you're going to be asking your question. This is documenting the reason for your investigation. Now, you see that most of the elements were already enabled in our July 25 implementation, but we've added an element called sequence. Now, as this is a repetitive component, you may ask multiple questions in a single investigation request on a transaction. If you're asking for further information, you might actually ask for more information. You might be asking for an account and address information, for example. If you decide to ask more than one question, raise more than one investigation within a single investigation request message, then you will repeat the investigation data component, and then you must use the sequence element because you're going to be identifying the different questions with a number for each individual question asked. The other elements, reason, subtype reason, and any additional request data, mainly the narrative request option, are not changing compared to our July 2025 implementation. On this slide, you see the list of the most frequently used reason codes, and on the final slide for this investigation request message, you can see the frequently used subtype reason codes for your investigation. So the advice is to use these codes as much as possible. Obviously, we're well aware that there is this all the way on the bottom of this slide, the request narrative, and that is where you can type in a free-formatted way your investigation, your question to your counterpart from which you received a transactional message. So again, little change in the investigation data component, but if you raise more than one question, you have to number the individual questions by providing sequence numbers for each repetition of the investigation data component. This brings us to the end of the discovery of changes to the investigation request or the CAMT 110 message. Let's now move to the last part of today's webinar, where we will highlight the changes to the investigation response or the CAMT 111 message that we will implement in November 2026. Now, the investigation response message, scope and usage. Here too, I'm not going into too much detail of the scope and usage as that has not really changed. The investigation response is the message used to respond to a previously received investigation request, meaning the CAMT 111 investigation response responds to a CAMT 110 investigation request message. The usage that you will find in our implementation guide explains the different use cases where you provide further information, you inform of an ongoing investigation that is still pending, or inform that you do not have additional information to satisfy the investigation request, in which case the parties involved will decide on the appropriate course of action. But the different use cases, when you receive an information request, you should respond, and depending on what information you have at hand, that response might be positive or negative. The flow That same diagram, we're now moving to the bottom part of the diagram. Remember, the first flow is where a message is sent, for example, a customer credit transfer. The receiver of that transfer has a question sent under flow 2, the investigation request, CAMT 110 message. What we're covering here is how to respond to CAMT 110 investigation request in receipt with the investigation response CAMT 111 message. Only 3 slides. This is a short message, the response message, and not that many changes will be implemented coming November 2026. The first block is the investigation response block that is used to provide the status or outcome of the investigation with the reason. As you notice, the 3 statuses remain the same. You can say that an investigation is closed, still pending, or has been rejected if you don't have the information. And also the table with reason codes for the status on the right side has not changed. We do notice an indication by the amber color on the bottom there that the actual investigation data component has changed. Let's check out on the next slide what changes we're making to that element within the investigation response component. This is a repetitive optional component to identify the original investigation reason and the response. Now, there is a lot of red on this slide, meaning change, but most of it is triggered by the changes to the investigation request CAMT 110 message and newly added information in that message that may or must be copied across the response message. Now, let's start with the original investigation sequence block, the first row in the table. If the request contained multiple questions, then you will use this element to tie your responses to the correct questions by using the original sequence number. Makes sense, of course. If you received an investigation request with 5 questions, all numbered 1 to 5, make sure that your responses keep that numbering to allow the receiver of your response to reconcile the responses to the numbered questions they sent. The original investigation reason and reason subtypes, which is row 2 and 3 on this slide, may be copied to enable routing of the response to the appropriate investigation department at the sender of the investigation request. This is optional. Now I'm going to skip over the response data for a second to cover the last 2 new elements shown in red. The related investigation data is a component that may be used to identify separately sent response information. For example, if there's an investigation on one of the customers involved, you may have to send a copy of a passport, for example, and you could reference that in your response, what and where that has been sent. The response originator, very similar to our request originator, may be used on an optional basis to identify the person or entity that provided the answer to the information request. If this is just the Fedwire Funds Service participant that received the request and is now sending the response, then obviously you do not need to provide that information. But if someone else has provided the information, the response, you may identify that person, entity, or financial institution in this element called response originator. So always it will depend on the type and complexity of your investigations, the investigations that you're dealing with. Now, let's have a look at the response data component. So we see that this has will change coming November 2026, as we have enabled some more structured options on top of the response narrative. Those of you that know the messages well, the response narrative, the bottom row in this second table, is what we went live with in July 2025, and that is where your response can be typed up in a free-formatted text box. What we're enabling to enhance automation investigations and their resolution are the top three rows that we will cover now. Now, the confirmation element would be used if this was an investigation about the application of amounts to an account to confirm the details of a successfully applied transaction. So if somebody asks a question about an amount, a value date that was applied, charges, you can respond here and you can confirm that the transaction was successfully processed and applied to the beneficiary's or the creditor's account and provide that information. Transaction status, which is the second row, would be used to respond to requests on the processing status of a transaction. For example, could be used to confirm settlement, rejection, or a pending status of a transaction that is being investigated. And the third new option, transaction data, that would be used to provide missing or correct information, payment transaction data. For example, if you receive investigation request from a correspondent that would like to have the account number that was missing of the client involved in the transaction, you can provide that specific transaction data, the account number, in this element transaction data. So you will provide the path and the actual information that was missing. If your correspondent would like to have full-blown postal address information, you can provide that structured postal address information in the element transaction data within the response data component. So obviously, last but not least, we are keeping the free-formatted option to provide your response in a narrative way, which is what is available today. So in summary, in the investigation response message, you can now structure your response, provide more structured information. Confirmation is used to confirm transaction data. Transaction status is where you will provide in coded form the status of the transaction that you received from your counterpart. Transaction data is where you will provide the missing or information or correct information in a structured way. And then, as enabled back in July 2025, the response narrative option where you type up your message as response to the investigation. Finally, the last slide for today's webinar, the original investigation request. That is where you will provide references to the original investigation request, CAMP 110 message that the investigation response, CAMP 111, relates to. We do see some changes as this component will contain some of the elements that were newly added to the investigation request message. What we see there is that EIR, that unique end-to-end investigation reference, has been added on an optional basis with the rule that you must have either the requester investigation identification or this newly added EIR reference. The request action box may be copied into the response. So this is where the sender of an initial investigation request followed up with a request action. You may copy that into your response on an optional basis. And then we see that also the new required underlying instrument, I'm investigating a wire payment, I'm investigating a cross-border payment or an instant payment, also that type of instrument, payment instrument that is under investigation, that has to be reported back into the response to make sure these transactions and these investigation responses are routed to the appropriate departments within the financial institution you're sending your response to. Now, with that, we have reached the end of this webinar where we provided an overview of the upcoming changes for the Fedwire Funds Service ISO 2022 release scheduled for the 16th of November 2026. We hope the overview of upcoming changes will help you with your preparations, and please remember to consult both the Fedwire Funds Service pages on My Standards and our Fedwire Funds Service ISO 2022 Implementation Center on our website frbservices.org for up-to-date information on all our Fedwire Funds Service ISO 2022 initiatives. Thank you and bye-bye.